I want to first commend the Public Service Union for holding this very important discussion this afternoon, evening. I think it's critically important. I want to say, however, that I believe that these conversations are not going to go very far if they become conversations in a way that I call horror stories. Because as has been mentioned, we have enough horror stories to go around. I think on the issue which we are dealing with, for those of us who were here from the very beginning, all of the presenters presented important information that speak to the question, that speaks around the question. And everybody said important things. But how do we connect the dots? How do we make this into a holistic information pool from which we can develop organizing strategies? And I think, for me, if we are dealing with issues that are episodic, it comes up now and it lasts 9 days and then another one flare up, we are never going to get to the bottom. I believe that, you know, about 134 years ago, a gentleman wrote a book called The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And in that book, he says that when men offered themselves, their hands, to women in holy matrimony, it was the biggest trick that men ever played on women. And the point that Frederick Engels was making in the book is that even after men offered themselves and became married to a woman, they never really stopped doing all the things that they were doing. Because at the very foundation of society, remember the book is called The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. At the very base of the society was a society that was male chauvinistic and patriarchal. And if the society is male chauvinistic and patriarchal, it explains, for example, how societies have come to accept things like clitoral circumcision, which is a horrific thing. But women would easily, normally, culturally, take their young daughters to be clitoral circumcised. So I would say that if we are serious about speaking to these issues, we cannot have, and it is unfortunate, I think, the development in St. Vincent, where depending on who is having a discussion, or depending on the nature of the discussion, the topic of the discussion, it immediately breaks down along political lines. And when it breaks down along political lines, certain people decided that they can't come to that or they can't come to that. I grew up in a tradition in St. Vincent where every Wednesday evening at the Extramural Center, which is the open campus now where Ronnie sits, there was a conversation every Wednesday evening, and that room was filled, and it went across the board, and people of all political persuasion and perspective came to speak to issues. I think that for us to solve the problem, or to begin to speak to the problem and to come up with some solutions. Ronnie talked about some important things. Zita talked about some important things. Our sister Richards from the National Council of Women spoke, and certainly our guests spoke to important things. But I believe if we are going to deal with sexual harassment, if we're going to deal with discrimination, we have to understand first and foremost that the society can't be half-free. If we are talking about national liberation, we could only have national liberation if we work towards the liberation and emancipation of women. We can't have women enslaved. We can't have a situation where a young woman has to give up her body in order to get a job. You can't have a situation where someone has to do all kinds of sexual favors in order to do certain things. But that responsibility, I think, primarily belongs to men. And we have to lift our consciousness. We have to lift our consciousness to know that it is our responsibility not to do the things that degrade and put down women. I heard my brother Kenrick said that he was thinking about becoming a politician, and he thought that, well, if you become a politician, you have to become a pretty boy. Well, I was a politician. I contested an election. I didn't have sex with no wholesale women all over the place. In fact, that was fundamentally against my own thinking and my own feeling. In fact, one person told me if I had had sex with more women, I probably would have eclipsed the 818 votes that I lost by, and that I might have won. But that is so antithetical to my feelings and my opinions and views that having lost, if that is the reason why I lost, well, so be it. But I think that what we need to do, and because the responsibilities so much belong to men, that I have been saying over and over, I say it on my Facebook page, I say it in my newspaper column, I say it on radio, that what we really need to develop is a he for she movement. Men need to lead the charge in fighting against sexual harassment and sexual violence, because it is us who perpetuate that crime, if you want to call it that. But I want to make one last point. Last year, 42 persons, we had 42 homicides in St. Vincent. And I don't think of the 42, 5 of them were females. But every time a female is assaulted or killed, we had a national outcry. And it seems to me that unless we look at sexual violence or sexual violence against women in the context of the larger violence in society, we are going to be the stone in the sea. Because you can't remove, if we say that the society is male chauvinistic and misogynist and patriarchal, and it is because of those contradictions in the society, as Franz Fanon said, why sometimes people who don't have the wherewithal to do a lot of other things end up taking it out on persons whom they perceive to be less than them, whom they feel they can conquer. Unless we take violence in that broad societal context, I don't think that we would be getting very far. I want to comment finally on the point that Luzette makes about talking, how you have a conversation without having a political conversation. Well, I think everything is politics and everything is not politics. It depends on how you present the conversation. I think a lot of times we end up muddying the water if our conversation is hyper-partisan. I think we muddy the water if we give the impression that somebody, whether that person is on the government side or the opposition side, that person is the representative. If you are opposition and somebody from the government side is speaking, the person who is speaking is the representation of evil. We don't have political disagreements with people anymore. What we end up saying is that if I disagree with this man, he has to be an evil person. And the moment we get to the point where we end up thinking that we can't have a conversation with someone because that person is different than us or is of a different political persuasion than us, we are not going to have cross-party or cross-union conversations. We can't do that. We can't do that. We have to, he for she movement, We have to be holistic in understanding violence and the nature of violence and where it's coming from and address them as a whole. Unless we do that, we're going to be stoned in the sea. Thank you.